So I will present this afternoon's session. This afternoon, our presentation is being provided by Nisa Kennedy, the Provincial Indigenous Employment Coordinator for Jedi. The presentation is Indigenous Reconciliation in the Workplace. The Joint Economic Development Initiative, or Jedi, is an Indigenous organization dedicated to supporting Indigenous participation in the New Brunswick economy. Jedi began in 1995 and as a tripartite partnership between the Indigenous community of New Brunswick, the Government of Canada, and the Government of New Brunswick. In 2009, Jedi was incorporated as an independent nonprofit organization, and over the years, Jedi has grown into an Indigenous organization focused on working closely with its partners from Indigenous communities, organizations, and government and private sector to foster Indigenous economic development in New Brunswick. Nisa is a Wolastoqey woman who is from New Brunswick. She has experience in advocacy, awareness, and program development for Indigenous peoples. Nisa has experience working with a variety of Indigenous groups from Calgary, Alberta to New Brunswick, and is passionate about working with youth and passionate about governance and leadership. So I'm so pleased to welcome Nisa Kennedy to speak to us this afternoon from Jedi.
Great, thank you, Nicole, for the warm introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen here and we can get started. Oh, started it. All right, well, like Nicole mentioned, my name is Nisa Kennedy. I'm the Provincial Indigenous Employment Coordinator with Jedi, otherwise known as Joint Economic Development Initiative. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Jedi office and where I'm speaking to you now is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey Malseet people. This territory and all of New Brunswick is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy's peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Wolastoqey, Malseet, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So as Nicole mentioned, here's a little background on Jedi. I won't say it again as Nicole did mention it already, but a little bit about Jedi is that we focus on the support of Indigenous peoples through entrepreneurship and small businesses, community economic development, workforce development, and partnerships with the public and private sector. So I wanted to open it up for everyone to first, let's discuss what is reconciliation. So if we could talk about, if you would like to put into the chat to you, what does reconciliation mean in the workplace? Yeah, providing an inclusive, inviting space for Indigenous employees. Recognition, yeah, inclusion. Yes, respect for multiple perspectives and values, absolutely. So reconciliation, lots of work and acceptance ahead, intensive learning to come. Absolutely. So reconciliation, and I have it here too, it's the process by which individuals and communities attempt to arrive at a place of mutual understanding and acceptance. So there isn't one approach to this. This is about achieving and building trust by examining those painful truths and shared histories. Acknowledging each other's truths and a common vision are essential to the process. I'm really glad that someone had mentioned having that multiple perspectives. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on as well, and the importance of seeing things through multiple perspectives. As I'm sure many are aware, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada had TRC had put forward 94 calls to action, and based on the findings from the stories of the survivors of residential school. So the call 92 is something that Jedi works towards within our own mandate, and that is to call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework, and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to the corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This could, but not be limited to, committing to the meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. And the third one is providing education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the UNDRIP treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I still have a bit of a cough when I talk. All right, so in order to understand what reconciliation means, we need to understand what the historical and current impacts are that are ongoing within the Indigenous communities, such as Indian residential school, the 60s scoop, systemic racism, child and family welfare, the justice system, and education, as well as missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, and the wide aspects of intergenerational trauma within the communities. So I'm not going to get into, the full history of what this looks like for Indian residential school in 60s scoop, but these were methods to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the wider Western society, as well as the systemic racism that is still at play right now when it comes to the funding sources that are available for Indigenous versus non-Indigenous counterparts within child and family welfare and the justice system and the educational system. As well as the intergenerational trauma that's still very widespread right now. So these all created disproportionate numbers of Indigenous peoples that experience a higher level of poverty, mental health, and addictions. And this also creates barriers for how to continue to be involved within the Indigenous workforce throughout the province. Many of these barriers are not unique to Indigenous peoples, but it's argued that they are more common because of the historic and intergenerational trauma resulting from the impacts of colonialism. So these are known as the legacies of colonialism, such as the racism and prejudices and unconscious biases and cultural differences. One thing to remember too is that we all have these legacies of colonialism. This isn't something that is just focused on Indigenous peoples only, is that we have all been impacted by colonial structures. So many of these barriers are known as internal or external barriers that operate either within the individual or outside the individual. As mentioned before, these are not unique to Indigenous peoples who have been impacted by colonialism, because everyone has been. And for non-Indigenous peoples, this is manifested in things like racism and discrimination and disengagement. And this is important because non-Indigenous peoples are more likely to be employers, to be managers, to be responsible for hiring. And if these people have negative attitudes, behaviors, or biases, they might impact the employment of the Indigenous person. So unconscious bias is defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. The unconscious bias can manifest in ways such as how we judge and evaluate others and how we act toward members of different groups. So remember when I mentioned that a person consciously, so remember when I mentioned that racism and prejudices can have an effect in the workplace, because typically it is the non-Indigenous person that's involved with the hiring and managing an Indigenous person within this workplace. So when those unconscious biases are involved there, and they can be subtle, but those actually can impact an Indigenous person in a negative way and make a sense of not belonging, uncomfortable, and may actually lead to burnout. So one of the trainings that Jedi has here is the Indigenous Reconciliation Awareness module. And so I'm going to show you a short video on what exactly this training is. And I'll provide the information as well if this is something of interest and individuals would like to participate in.
My name is Ashley Brooks. I am the Indigenous Reconciliation Awareness Module Coordinator. The Indigenous Reconciliation Awareness Module provides education to organizations on Indigenous history and reconciliation and how to promote an inclusive workplace environment. So the program helps organizations to understand colonization and how it has affected Indigenous peoples over the course of hundreds of years, and further to that, how to properly understand acts of reconciliation and what that might mean and how to implement it in their workspaces. So the IRAM program covers topics like contact, the 60 Scoop, Indian residential schools, day schools, reconciliation, as I mentioned, and the Peace and Friendship Treaties. Jedi wanted to make sure that they created the Indigenous Reconciliation Awareness module in the right way. So prior to the launch in 2017 of the IRAM module, Jedi consulted with residential school survivors, residential school survivor descendants, as well as support workers and cultural awareness delivery providers in order to create this program. And businesses of all sizes have benefited from an IRAM session since the program was developed in 2017. Feedback from participants of all backgrounds has been overwhelmingly positive. Participants have left sessions feeling very empowered and inspired to continue their reconciliation journey and to implement some of the tools and resources that they've learned through the IRAM module in their workplaces.
So reconciliation is important to me because I look at things differently now. And again, because of my upbringing and because of the teachings of my parents and my grandparents that weren't right, that it's allowed me to focus my life and have new relationships with people that are different than they were in the past. So my first experience with the IRAM wasn't really the IRAM, it was the blanket exercise. It was through a plenary that Jedi offered, but it was an initial start for me. And I can remember really struggling, especially around the talking circle. And so I get into the car on my way home that day, and my wife asked me how I did, or how was the day, and I immediately broke down in tears and couldn't stop. That was the start of it. And that's when I knew that I had to learn more, and I had to participate more fully in this and help other people with that same learning that happened to me. It was the start of a journey. There's no other way I can put it. I don't know. It's probably one of the more impactful things that have helped me understand about history and about the truth. And so when you learn about the truth, that's a good thing. Although there's exposure the first day, that's the second day that pounds home those issues even deeper through not only just people passing you knowledge, but also through group discussions and with non-Indigenous people, and it's possibly it is with Indigenous people as well. There's more fruitful discussions that come out of I didn't know that. And so that leads into another person basically saying, I've learned something here and I'm going to take that home. Because I think I live reconciliation. I try to live reconciliation. It's every part of me. I think when I look at my past history, I think of myself as a younger person and not really understanding. And through the reconciliation modules, that was my first real understanding, that moment that I understood, or I started to understand about what reconciliation should be or could be. Life-changing. Really, it's been life-changing. And again, that might seem like an overstatement, but it has. It really has. Again, I'm so much in favor of people taking IRAM training to start on a journey of reconciliation. I can't tell you, it's very impactful.
Okay. Oh, great. So some of the participants have actually already participated with the Jedi's IRAM. Okay, awesome. So I really appreciate the feedback there. I have another question for everyone, and I know I had already talked about this before, but what exactly is unconscious bias? And if you could put that into the chat, and how does unconscious bias impact the Indigenous peoples in the workplace from your perspective? Creating climate of navigating and enduring continual harms. Yeah. Beliefs you hold without realizing them. Stereotypes. Yeah. Yeah, so when it comes to Indigenous peoples, I think this gets into, the notion of tokenism for Indigenous peoples, and the stereotypes that are withheld that way. And that's where it really can lead to that burnout for Indigenous peoples if they're kind of acted as the liaison, and having to continually hold that space for a lot of those stereotypes, or the relationship isn't very positive with, say, an organization or the Indigenous communities. The Indigenous person that is acting as the liaison can actually end up having burnout or, just disengagement from their role. So those are things that can happen within the workplace. Promotes inauthentic communication. Yes, definitely. I think there could be a lot of negative consequences that are endured, definitely on both sides, right? So there's a lot of how unconscious bias can impact Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people within the workplace. So this is where we get into the notion of two-eyed seeing, a gift of multiple perspectives. So that was why I was really happy to see that someone had mentioned, seeing different perspectives within a workplace. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to continue to create the most respectful workplace, is where you feel, where everyone that works within that place feels heard and understood. So two-eyed seeing helps us to acknowledge the idea of wholeness. A part of many Indigenous knowledge systems is looking through one eye to see things through Indigenous perspectives and alongside Western ways of knowing, while inviting these two eyes to work together as they do collectively. So when we think about two-eyed seeing, it's the notion that you could be having the Indigenous perspective when the situation or circumstance calls for it. Whereas in a different situation, a more Western approach would be more appropriate in that circumstance. So when you're thinking about Indigenous peoples that work within the workplace, this could be even looking at, like when the onboarding is happening for an Indigenous employee, asking if there's any cultural activities that they need to be mindful of, where they may need to take additional time off due to ceremonial practice or cultural practices. When we look at bereavement leave, that could look different for an Indigenous person. Rather than a day off for a funeral, this could be days of ceremony involved. If you look at certain times of the season, there may be additional times that need to be taken off for hunting or fishing. So those are things to be mindful of when it comes to, onboarding an employee and creating that respectful workplace, is understanding that there may be cultural practices that are at place, community practices that are at place, and being able to guide which things are, appropriate and which things are maybe a different situation would call for that more. So there's different methods or different ways of seeing different multiple perspectives within a workplace. I'm having all of the technical difficulties today, I think. So based on the overview that I provided of what two-eyed seeing is, what do you see are some of the benefits of integrating those Indigenous approaches into the workplace? Remove barriers, more awareness of the possible needs of your Indigenous employees. Yeah. And I think really it really wouldn't, it's not just something that would benefit Indigenous employees or people within the workplace as well, but this benefits most individuals within the workplace, because it's really about getting to know the individual, and there may be specific needs that are required within the place of employment. Yeah, and you know, one thing about the two-eyed seeing approach is that it's not about, you know, having a land acknowledgement or putting certain language in an email. This is more about, you know, having those perspectives at the table when decisions are made and being able to lean on those decisions at the most appropriate time, as well as listening and really realizing the impact of what an Indigenous person may be saying and how you can incorporate that into the workplace culture. It doesn't mean like completely overhauling everything, but it's just about, you know, providing the space to be able to listen and see what value is there, and that could be incorporated into the workplace. So Jedi has put together a document called Developing Best Practices. And number one thing is know the communities, learn about the First Nation communities located near the organization, population, and economic development projects. And knowledge can be gained through a variety of ways. And this is something where Jedi is here to assist with that, with getting to know and building those meaningful relationships with the communities that surround New Brunswick. One thing to remember too is that these relationships aren't going to be built overnight. This is something that's going to take time, and patience is key. And all of these little steps, like providing two-eyed seeing approaches within the workplace, that gift of multiple perspectives, understanding the unconscious bias, that's something that we all have. Those little steps are important for creating big change. So that's how we build up those best practices of Indigenous engagement, hiring Indigenous, working with Indigenous communities. So those are the things that we need to do and think about, is all those little steps that will lead to the big change. So, understand and adapt to the culture. So like I had mentioned, this doesn't mean completely overhauling the organizational the organization's operations. The key here is to understand protocols that are in place for Indigenous peoples in your local community and adapt to the communication style. One thing that we've mentioned in the past in other presentations or people that we've worked with is sometimes we can avoid eye contact when we're talking to someone, and it's not to be rude or disengaged from the conversation. It's that act of listening and a sign of respect to look away as somebody that you respect is talking to you, and so you're actively listening to what they're saying. It's not actually a form of disengagement. But those were things that, when it comes to, say, hiring, the expectation is that you're looking in someone's eyes, but in their mind, in the cultural communication style, it means that you're actively listening, and you're looking away as you're listening to them. So those are things that actually came from residential school, and it's now been ingrained into the communication style of how we speak in some situations. Not to say that's for everyone, but those are things to be mindful of when it comes to working with Indigenous peoples. Let's see. There's many other forms too of communication styles, but those are things just to be mindful of, that certain circumstances and situations may have different communication styles at place, and just being mindful of that and being okay with it, and not questioning it as much, or thinking that there was some form of disrespect. So number 3 is do the work. Reconciliation begins at the top. Set precedents for the organizational culture. I had mentioned before, the notion of tokenism, or thinking that cultural awareness training is something that's just kind of one and done. No, it's something that has to be continuously going on and continuously trying to change, as well as it needs to start from the top. It does need to be those that are, managers in leadership, those that are hiring. So that's where that begins. And then it will trickle down into the organizational culture. You have to set that precedence for what that's going to look like and make those expectations when people are hired on, that those are trainings that are to be done within the workplace, so that that meaningful conversation, meaningful relationships are built and continue to flourish. So some further examples of what reconciliation in the workplace would look like is utilizing trauma-informed practices for those in service delivery and really those in many different workspaces. Understanding that being trauma-informed, you'll start to realize the sense of what different triggers may be there for an Indigenous person that's working in this organization. For example, if somebody works in the child welfare system, there may be their own traumas that they have to work through, but that means putting in extra supports in place so that they're going to still be able to thrive within their workplace, as well as there's many different areas and sectors where those situations can arise. So having more trauma-informed practices within the workplace to provide additional supports for Indigenous peoples. Like I had mentioned before, having a thorough onboarding plan, including those supports. For those that are non-Indigenous, having that educational plan for what trainings are required to have cultural competency within the workplace. And like I said before, cultural awareness isn't something that you can do once and it be done and, you're culturally aware now. It's something that you have to continue to work through and work on and research and actively engage for it to have a meaningful change within the workplace. And it needs to, like I mentioned, begin at the top. Avoiding tokenism, having the one specific role that is, the one that is to speak to the communities, be engaged with Indigenous peoples. That's going to have a quick burnout for those that are in those roles. It doesn't, so those don't create those safe, culturally competent workplaces. So being aware of that and trying to actively avoid tokenism is important. Like I had mentioned before, addressing the leave policies to be inclusive and accommodating, especially bereavement. Include Indigenous cultural options in your EAP. So reconciliation in the workplace, this is another document and resource that Jedi has, and it is available on our website as well. And it goes into further detail. Protocols and practices for meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples. So understanding and respecting that there's diverse cultures and nationhood along with their historical and colonial context. So there may be different aspects of the relationship that you would have with, say, one community in a northern part of the province versus a community that is more in the southern area, or maybe is in an urban area versus a rural location. So those are things to take into consideration. Know exactly why you're engaging with the Indigenous community and what is the overall goal for that relationship. Building long-lasting and good relationships with Indigenous peoples. There's a saying that if you're doing it in a good way, good things are going to come of it. But what is the good in that? And what is the good relationship? What is the good goal that is trying to be accomplished there? Have key contacts and partners to engage or consult in the early stages. And that's the emphasis is on the early stage. Having that engagement, having that two-eyed seeing approach of engaging with the communities, understanding the multiple perspectives that are there, and being able to identify that in the early stages of that relationship. So some other things that Jedi is working on is the Indigenous Reconciliation Employer Action Plan. It's a big, nice, long title. One thing that we will be having is an Indigenous Workforce Summit in November. It will be for Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants, focused on our new trainings that are developing, engaging with the Indigenous workforce, how to mitigate the barriers to employment for Indigenous people, as well as some overviews of the Mesh Diversity platform. So there will be 2 new trainings that are developed, and I've kind of discussed the unconscious bias a bit here today, as well as the 2-wide seeing. We are developing those into 2 separate trainings that would be something that works alongside the Indigenous Reconciliation Awareness module. So think of them kind of as the next steps with cultural competency in the workplace. Now, Mesh Diversity is a diversity intelligence company, and they're based out of New Brunswick as well. So this project is going to this component of this project here is to look at the cultural safety and belonging within a workplace, and how does that relate to Indigenous perspectives, and what are Indigenous peoples experiencing within the workforce of New Brunswick. So that's something that project is going to help identify and be able to create recommendations that we can utilize in the future, as well as a social media campaign on combating online hate throughout the province and utilizing positive change to combat that hate. So some other tools and resources that we have is our employer toolkit. And I've mentioned now the employer action plan, the Indigenous Reconciliation Awareness module, 2-wide seeing approaches to the workplace, and the unconscious bias and anti-racism training. So the 2-wide seeing approaches to the workplace is actually going to be a e-learning module. So it's something that somebody could do on their own time. It's not actually a in-person training. So that will actually work a lot better with some people's schedules too. So there's some different options for having those resources and researching what does it mean to have reconciliation in the workplace? How do I build more meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples? And how can I be more culturally competent in my role? And those are questions that we should be continuing to ask ourselves on an ongoing basis, even after taking cultural awareness training and thinking that we may be culturally competent. What's changed? There's always new information that's out there. So we have to remember that the structure of learning is going to be cyclical, and it's not some linear one style approach. There's going to be different methods of continuing that education and continuing what reconciliation looks like for the future. Well, it looks like we may end a little bit earlier than initially was planned, but I was going to add in my contact information in the chat if there was anyone that had any questions for me. Let's see.
That was very interesting, Nisa. One question that comes to mind for me as you talk about the trainings that the Jedi is putting together to have coming up for folks, has that come out of an employer demand or an employer request that you've been getting these requests, or is that something that you've had in the works yourselves?
A little bit of both. A lot of the feedback from the IRAM sessions was that there was a need for more what are the next steps? Okay, now I know what the history and the current challenges are and what's going on. But what do I do with this information? So that was something that's been the feedback for a while. So IRAM began in, I believe, 2016. So throughout that time, since then, there's been the TRC calls to action, and there's been um, the number of children that have been found throughout the country with residential schools. So there was a lot more information that's been happening, a rise in wanting to have that history and that knowledge known. But then what do you do with that information? How do you take that information and incorporate it into the workplace? So that's kind of where these trainings started to come from. So we've been working on this for a period of time now, and we're getting ready to launch these trainings here in the fall. So hopefully this will kind of help with creating those structural changes for creating a respectful workplace.
Absolutely. I know I certainly am interested in taking those sessions. I think it's so important that we continue to engage in that kind of material. Whether we are working with Indigenous communities or not, I think that we need to continue that engagement.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Are you finding that in those trainings, are you having to start, even in your IRAM training sessions, are you having to start with the absolute basics of the history, or are you able to focus more on the local New Brunswick history, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy histories?
Yeah, so it does have the general overview of what I guess the federal relation with Indigenous peoples is, but it does focus in on specifically our region in New Brunswick, so the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy. Most of it does touch mostly on the Wolastoq and Mi'kmaq communities, as well as provides perspectives because we've had one residential school here in the Maritimes, and so all of that era of time, they would have gone to that school, right? So it provides a perspective of given their experiences in this area, as well as there's day schools. That was something that provides that insight as well. And the day schools were very prominent throughout New Brunswick.
And I don't think that's something that's well understood, where just because something's called day school doesn't mean that there's less of a chance that there was a lot of abuse taking place. And I think it's important for those of us who live in this region to understand that.
Absolutely. And realizing too that this wasn't that long ago. It's within our lifetime. And those are things that we tend to forget because it seems like it was so distant away. But I mentioned earlier in the presentation about 60s scoop, and so that was in the 60s, but now they're mentioning the millennial scoop because it was something it's still happening, and the 60s scoop began, but now there's things that are happening to in this day. So a lot of it is still something that continues on. Oh, I was just seeing if I got some feedback here. Oh, Lynn mentioned, yes, we have a Facebook group called IRAM Alumni. So that's actually where those that have participated in the IRAM, they can go there for more updated information as well as ask questions there. And it's a space to be able to continue that education and learning and be able to ask questions and not feel like you're misunderstood or anything like that. So it's just a safe space to be able to continue to learn that.
But also a space where people can go instead of necessarily putting the expectation on the Indigenous people in their own lives, their friends or their colleagues to answer those questions.
Yes, exactly. And we do mention this in IRAM where it can be, mentally or emotionally exhausting to be that liaison person for Indigenous people. And we can't speak for everybody else. You know, my personal experiences are going to be different than even Ashley's experiences. So those are things that we have to be mindful of when we think about that tokenism in the workplace, which is something that does happen. And just creating that more culturally safe. There's so many different resources that are available now to be able to educate ourselves on any topic. So it's just about taking the time to if we want to learn, we will, right? So
we have a question here in the Q&A. Are those trainings this fall open to anyone to sign up for them, or scheduled for a specific group of people? So would it be your workplace has to schedule it, or is it something that people can register as individuals for?
So both. So an organization can schedule them specifically, and it just be their organization that participates, and that's something that can be coordinated with Ashley. However, Jedi does host pay per seats, and we put those on our Eventbrite page, so individuals can just pay for one seat if it's something that either they want to do on their own, or perhaps there's not enough participants at an organization that are going to be taking it. Then they can take that option instead and just pay for a few seats to be enrolled in the training. And the IRAM training can be delivered in 2 different methods. So it could be delivered either in a day and a half in person, or over 4 days, 4 half days throughout a week. So there's some different methods. It really depends on the flexibility or what an organization is looking for. But
what's the reason for the second day? Is there, I'm assuming it's obviously there's such a large amount of content, but
yeah. So the first half day for an in-person session is a Kairos blanket exercise. And then the full day, which is the following day, goes into all of the different subject matter. So it goes right through from the history, current issues. It goes into policies and structures in Canadian or Indigenous communities. So it goes into that thorough understanding and education on that second day. And then for the 4 half day methods, it's just more so you do the blanket exercise on the first half day. However, you know, with virtual learning, it can be a little bit daunting, and it's heavy subject matter. So it's just broken up a little bit more in that virtual format.
I think that's really exciting to hear that it's set up that way. I know I've done the Kairos blanket exercise, and I've done it virtually. I've never had the opportunity to do an in-person one, but you do learn so much, and I think it's really important to do that extra educational piece.
Jedi's next virtual IRAM session starts on September 13th. So you can register for it. Thanks, Gwen.
And I would encourage anyone to seek out that and to seek out Jedi's Eventbrite page for those other sessions coming up.
Taking the test.
Oh, thank you, Glenn.
Oh, great. She has the session right there. Awesome. Just reading this last comment here. And I think that's something that we forget, right? Is that we've all been colonized in this world, right? There's different structures at play all the time. So it's more about recognizing that's for ourselves, and how do we create more engagement and positive change, not just for the Indigenous relationships, but for all of us as a whole. And that's really what it comes down to when you talk about that whole 2-eyed seeing approach, right? Is recognizing when is that perspective needed in these situations.
I know I've certainly been having conversations with my colleagues. I work in workplace conflict resolution in the field, so I'm directly dealing with clients and employees in conflict and managers in conflict on a daily basis. And there's been a lot of conversation in the last year or so about incorporating the two-eyed seeing approach into casework. And how are we, and how is that, how is or isn't that being incorporated into workplace conflict situations?
No, that's awesome that that's happening now. I was talking with someone actually last week that about how that two-eyed seeing perspective is being utilized a lot more now. And there's more recognition for how to use that in all of these different sectors where it's really important to understand that.
Would you, I know you're reading that, Nisa, but would you, is there anything that Jedi would point people to, whether it's this resource you've developed or a resource that you have seen online that you think is good, that would help people understand more broadly the two-eyed seeing approach?
So we're actually going to be having that e-learning module and having, yeah, so we'll be able to teach that a bit more and go into more depth of what that looks like for people and how to put that into the workplace. So I just gave, small overviews, but it'll be some good sessions on it as well too. And Elder Albert Marshall, who actually coined the term two-eyed seeing, he actually was a part of that process and creating it too. So he's very aware of it and he's excited to see it all come together. Yeah, because two-eyed seeing actually came from the integrative sciences. So Elder Albert Marshall actually worked with the science community, I think it's at Dalhousie University, to incorporate ways and methods to get more Indigenous peoples into the sciences. And so that was where that two-eyed seeing approach came from when looking at the natural sciences. But now we've been able to adopt it and look at that in a multitude of different circumstances and situations and be able to see how that gift of multiple perspectives and how to do things or how to learn about something can be, moved into all these different fields of work. So that's kind of where that came from.
It's a really interesting model. And I imagine that you see occasions where people, when you talk about tokenism, I imagine you see occasions where people say, well, I'm incorporating a two-eyed seeing approach, but really what they're doing is simply a land acknowledgement or simply a blessing. Not that those are bad things, those are important things, but they're doing it as a checkbox and they're not fully thinking through the integration.
Absolutely. And I think that's where it comes down to is we need to recognize what is that integration look like and who do we need to talk to make sure that we're going about that in a good way. So that's where you got to start engaging with the communities and engaging in building those meaningful relationships and avoiding having, a negative brand with the community. So that's one thing that I think people will forget too, is that brand is really important to Indigenous peoples. And I don't mean brand as in like a logo, but it's that community brand of do they have a good relationship with us? And if they don't, you're not going to be able to see any good change really happen. It has to be all these little things that add up and it takes time. So those are things we always have to be mindful of.
So it sounds like from your perspective, the relationship building is just as vital as or that really big important first step if there's going to be work towards reconciliation for workplaces, that it can't
Va falloir faire ce travail pour le milieu de travail.
Oh, sorry, I think our translation got switched around there for a second. That there needs to be relationship building with the community and it can't just be done in isolation.
Absolutely.
Do any of our participants have any more questions for Nisa on this interesting information about Jedi's programming? We're getting some really positive feedback on the IRAM program in the chat. Well, Nisa, my last question for you, I think really is, what do you find is the biggest barrier to bringing reconciliation or Indigenous awareness into workplaces, and what can the people who are listening today or who are watching today, what can they do themselves to start from their side of creating the barrier? What can they do to start pulling that barrier down?
I think the biggest barrier is being able to educate ourselves and taking that time and having that first initiative of trying to learn about it. I think that's the biggest barrier, because those that want to learn about it, they already are doing the active engagement. It's the individuals that maybe are just not aware of these things yet in order to take that training or to research those things. So I think that's what the biggest barrier of all of this is having more allies that can speak to being able to help educate as well. So it's not always on, the Indigenous person to have to do that education.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think, it makes sense that there needs to be spaces for people to go learn, but they can't be expecting it constantly from the Indigenous people in their lives. And also they need to, I think those of us who are engaging and trying to learn ourselves need to do the very difficult task that we all know is the very difficult task of speaking up and addressing these needs and these gaps in our own communities. We need to speak, be very open with our work, in our workplaces with the gaps we see, or be very open with our families with the gaps we see. Because, as you said, an Indigenous community member can't be expected, or Indigenous organizations can't be expected to constantly be the ones pointing them out, that we are all part of this situation.
And it's exhausting. It'll be exhausting for anyone. But those are things that are definitely important. I'm just going through the. So, oh great, Gwen was able to add in our resources that we have on the website there. So the Indigenous Workforce Summit, you will be able to register for that event here shortly, and that will be on the Jedi website. I would really urge everyone here, if you haven't already, if you go to the Jedi website, you can actually sign up for newsletters and upcoming events. And if you put your email in there, you'll be able to know when those registrations open or any new resources that are available. You could be able to put that in there.
I know one of the difficult things I find, I'm sure lots of people who are busy workdays find, is you have the intention of wanting to learn these things and then you forget or you get busy and it falls off your plate. And so I find, I'm signed up to the Jedi newsletter. I find it's a great way of reminding myself that I have a responsibility to step in and step up and take these things. They make it easy, isn't it? Right to your inbox.
Yeah. Or if you have Facebook, you can follow on Facebook. Does Jedi work with volunteer organizations? I guess it depends on what the capacity that you're asking, but yes.
Nancy, would you mean if people want to access training for their volunteers or their employees at their nonprofit? Lynn has written in here, I wish more of my family members and friends would be more proactive to learn. Do you think it's fear that holds non-Indigenous people back from wanting to know the truth and about our history?
I don't know about if it's fear, but I think, well, maybe it's the idea of the unknown or how it's going to impact you, right? I think so for some people it can be very, very highly emotional to go through those trainings. So there could be that fear of those emotions coming up, or maybe not really knowing what to do with that information. So perhaps, but I think that's where you got to dig down and maybe have those conversations with your friends or family members and be like, so what's stopping you from wanting to learn more about that? And and having that perspective of being like, I'm open to hearing what you have to say, but this is how I view the situation.
Oh, so Nancy is suggesting that her and Nisa connect outside of work. So Nancy, you're welcome to send Nisa your contact info directly over the chat. Thanks for understanding that it might be noisy if we connect to you wherever you're on your vacation. We're jealous you're on your vacation. Christine has said, to answer Lynn above, I think that it is deeper than fear. I think that to understand is to carry such a deep feeling of responsibility and sadness. People do not always want to know the injustices that have occurred. I agree. I also think that it speaks to something that for those of us who were in Manju Verma's presentation earlier this morning, Manju is the new commissioner on systemic racism in New Brunswick, and she was speaking about the reality of systemic racism versus this idea that a racist person is a person with an intention towards racism. And I think that we have, as a culture, we have created this boogeyman that is the racist, and we never want to address or accept that we are part of that system. And I think until we're able to say, I think that we need to be the ones having those conversations with other non-Indigenous people, that the reality is, if we are always acting like racism exists or bias exists in this evil, angry boogeyman, then we're never going to address and acknowledge the reality of the systems in place that continue these issues. I mean, as Nisa said, these are not issues that are all in the past by any means.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the fear and difficulty for some folks sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I think it's having to identify those painful realities of ourselves in order to move forward. And sometimes we're just not ready to do that. But everyone's on a different journey with their self-discovery, with their education. So I think it just starts with beginning to have some of those conversations with your family and friends, and get that spark kind of flowing of, okay, maybe that is something I want to learn more about. And just having those little conversations like that, I think that's what's going to create those bigger that bigger momentum of change and education.
And I would certainly, as someone who comes from a conflict management and mediation perspective, I would say one thing I always tell people when they're trying to learn how to communicate better in conflict or learn how to be more assertive in conflict, I always tell them to start small, to start with the small things that will teach their brain that it's not as scary as they initially thought it was. And I think that this is something where we can, yes, we want to jump in and we want to do the big things first, but I think, Nisa's made a really wonderful point about how there's small changes that grow. And so for those of us from the non-Indigenous community, if we are making a small change here and there, if we are having that conversation with someone, we are less frightened of their response about it. I mean, we all, I hate to admit it, but I hate to say it, but we all still have a family member who maybe is young or maybe is not so young, who still has some quite biased beliefs about the Indigenous community in New Brunswick or in Canada. And we might not want to start there for fear of the reaction. That might be what's holding us back from ever having those conversations. But if instead we say to a colleague, I went to this great presentation by Jedi today, when we say to our parent who we know is less likely to react, I went to this great presentation by Jedi today. We start in those small spaces that are less frightening, and we teach our brain that it's not as scary, so that when it comes to a moment where we realize we have to speak up and say something to that family member who is probably being overtly racist, I hate to say, but we all have them in New Brunswick, that family member who's being overtly racist, we might feel more ready to do it. Does anyone have any more questions for Nisa before she's been so gracious in having this conversation with me?
No, it's been great. I love it. And I love all the feedback about the IRAM sessions, and I can't wait for the other trainings to be launched, and then you can get more info on that unconscious bias and the two-eyed seeing then. So like I mentioned, I think it would be really great for If you haven't already, get the newsletter, and then you can stay up to date with everything that's going on with Jedi.
Well, thank you so much, Nisa, for coming and presenting. I'm so sorry you're not feeling well, but you've been so generous with your time with us.
I feel fine. I just have this cough, and so it sounds a lot worse than it is.
We're less bothered by it by being virtual. If we were in the same
Yeah.
room as you, we might be a bit more uncomfortable with your cough.
Yes, that's the perks of virtual.
Thank you so much for giving us this time and for coming and presenting on Jedi. It's an organization that has an incredible reputation, incredibly good reputation in New Brunswick. And so we were so pleased to have you guys come speak for Respectful Workplace Week this year.
Well, great. Thank you for having me. It was a really fantastic time. Thank you.